They handed my sister a BMW with a red bow and a camera. Ready smile, like giving a prize to a puppy. The showroom lights gleamed off her lacquered hair. My mother's nails tapped the chrome as if punctuation for a sentence I'd never hear. My father, who'd taught me to bleed for respect, laughed like a man who thinks a car can erase an old debt. They wrapped the moment a champagne in crystal, a shaky Instagram live, hashed cane that smelled of entitlement. They put $2 crumpled in my hand. I remember the exact way the bank note folded between my fingers, how the edges felt soft from being passed from palm to palm in a life that never held me with any care. $2 for the daughter who took a bus for university and later paid for her textbooks with supermarket leftovers. $2 for the daughter who learned how to be invisible because it was cheaper than asking. It's something, my mother said, as if she were offering me a consolation prize at a school bake sale. My sister kissed her on the cheek with the kind of bright, automatic affection rehearsed in front of mirrors. The red bow caught a stray shaft of sunlight and exploded into a small flame of pride. I left that night at 2 a.m. I did not slam any doors or shout for apologies. I turned off the porch light so the CTV and record on the shape to the sapphires of the house and the sleeping dog. I walked to the curb where the street lamp hummed and the cold bit through my jacket, and I blocked them on everything. Phone, email, the private group chat where cousins congratulated her like she had won a scholarship. Gone. I left like someone who knows the only way to become the axis of your own life is to stop orbiting someone else's. In the silence that followed, the city felt like a different country. It tasted like iron and coffee, and the cheap cigarettes my neighbors smoked on the 7th-floor landing. I had $2 in my pocket and a bus ticket to nowhere. I had a name and I had a small, coiled hunger that refused to call itself anything but refusal. People ask later. On the sidewalk outside the courthouse, when the cameras angle their lenses at me as if I were a curiosity, as if a generous woman had simply fixed her family back together. Why I didn't scream, why I didn't chain myself to the BMW, why I blocked them, why I left at 2. You do not understand the weight of being handed a red bow across someone else's lap. You do not understand how small the $2 felt until you realize it was never money that cut. It was the message. They wanted gratitude. They wanted my consent stamped with a smile. They wanted me to accept the hierarchy, the votes of value they'd cast on each of their children. They thought the bow on my sister's car was a coronation. They thought the $2 were a joke, a story to tell at brunch. So I learned to make jokes of my own. In the months after I left, I learned the language of details. I learned how to read a ledger like scripture, how to listen for a lie in the way a person puts sugar in their tea. I lived in cramped apartments, changed my hair, took jobs that paid under the table. I memorized bus routes and the rhythms of different cities. My pockets were always half empty like an apology, but some observation was filling me, an inativation of patience, an anatomy of attention. I worked nights at a data center once, wiping drives until my fingertips bled tiny crescents under the dirt. I took a short course in accounting because the old men at the bar said numbers never lie. The more I studied money, the more I saw the seams in other people's lives. How a donation to some community program padded a line on a corporate sheet. How a house could be paid for with a check from a shell company that only existed on paper and in the inbox of someone very polite by the verist cessically refert and well-narrated veris. I did not tell myself I was becoming a person who would ruin lives. I told myself I would become someone who could see the truth when it arrived, like a sudden diagnosis. But you can't study this without becoming a little cold. You can't see accounting as a map without understanding how to follow the bloodline to the heart. My parents had been generous with appearances, not with truth. When I sat in a tiny public library with a stack of decades, old business journals and a laptop, the transactions shone like nervous veins, donations that were too round, contractors who always overbilled and were never seen, tax shelters nested inside other tax shelters like matryoshka dolls. My father's companies, those neat little letterheads that paid for his suits and the vintage watch he only wore to dinners, were a landscape of convenient miracles. I started small. I petitioned for copies of Employed as a concerned former employee of a company that didn't exist anymore. I filed FOIA requests and read between the white spaces of court filings. People have no idea how much information sits in plain sight if you have the patience to look. My sister's car sat shiny in photographs saved on my old email. She posted videos of herself in the driver's seat, eyelashes fluttering like currency. She took back roads and posted selfies with the bow reflected in the window, chewing gum like a queen. I confess now, and the confession tastes like rust. I wanted them to feel the same cold exposure I'd felt in that showroom. But I wanted more than the small, trivial thrill of humiliation. I wanted the structure. Every loose stone that made that house of lies stand up in the first place. Cracked, not just the bow taken off. There are ways to topple monuments without sledgehammers. There are ways to open someone's life like an envelope and let the small reveals spill. I learned to be surgical. I found auditors who were bored and hungry for a headline. I found a journalist who smelled like thrift coffee and wore a single ring on his thumb, who laughed and said, "Are you serious?" and then showed up with a recorder because he could not ignore the shape of my story. I sent him transfers, bank transfers, emails requesting that consultation fees to companies that had no offices, invoices date with the same date as my father's honeymoon. I sent him the footage of my sister, the Instagram story where she said, "Daddy pays," and then laughed like a child pulling a prank on me. We worked like conspirators. We were careful. The journalist wrote about patterns, and then about a particular donation, then about a contractor who'd been paid 20,000s, 100 for a patio that had never been built. The city began to look harder. The county auditors officially opened an investigation. The FBI showed up like black moths at the edge of their property, polite men who carried legal pads, and didn't laugh when my mother asked them if that meant they weren't going to be coming to dinner anymore. When the searches began, my mother screamed. She clutched her pearls and wielded the red bow like it had been a talisman to ward off questions. My father turned ashen and did not try to lie. He was taught to think money could fix anything. He had not anticipated that someone could turn the logic of his own ledgers against him. "You did this," my sister whispered on a voice message I had preserved. "Why would you do this? Why would you?" She had never asked me why when I left. She had never called to know where I slept. She only knew how to write me into a story as the background noise of other people's happiness. Her voice, when she thought I could hear it, was small and uncertain. She sounded like the child who had learned to model affection, because it was currency. The arrests were not cinematic in the way people imagine. There were no dramatic handcuffs under the chandelier. There was a gray morning when men in suits walked up the driveway with subpoenas like apologies. There was the sound of my father's keys dropping like a confession on the tile. My mother collapsed onto the Persian rug as if it were a stage, and she a player who had forgotten her lines. I watched the live stream of the raid from a diner that smelled like burnt coffee and dish soap. I had been the anonymous tip in the early days, the mysterious email that suggested auditors look at a series of shell companies. I had been the woman who forwarded old invoices with yellow highlights and a single sentence. "Look here." The investigators called me Confidential Source A. My name did not appear on any file until the trial. I liked it that way. Anonymity is a kind of safety net when your hands are full of other people's collapses. My sister did not go to jail. She didn't need to. There was no legal mechanism for punishing a person for greed absent a tie to fraud. She was not the architect of the scheme, she was its ornament. But her life unraveled in the specific, cruel ways that are often worse than bars. The BMW with the red bow had been bought by her on credit, through a line that traced in a single crooked line, back to one of my father's consulting firms. When the firm collapsed, the credit did not evaporate. Repossessors came in the noonday light like vultures. She posted a video, one of those apologetic things where she speaks into the camera and then wipes her face like she might melt. She said, "They've been awful to me." And then, with a greed that did not comprehend the nature of fairness, she tried to sell herself as a victim. People laughed. People sent her memes of red bows and empty receipts. The comments were cruel in a way I had tasted before when I was 17, and eating ramen for dinner with existential emptiness, because there was no red bow for me at 17 either. But the real twist wasn't the repossession of a car. Anyone can take a car. I wanted the architecture of their lives to be dismantled. The bank accounts, the nonprofit facade, the positions on community boards where they smiled and shook hands like they were painting over decay. I wanted to see their names scrubbed from plaques. I wanted my mother's pearls to be auctioned and for the buyer to ask, with all the politeness of strangers, "Did you inherit these?" And for my mother to answer, "No, I found each crack. I followed it. I was quiet and merciless in the way of people who understand bureaucracy. You don't need to scream. You need to locate the hinge and loosen it with patience." At first, people didn't know who I was. They thought I was simply a woman who'd glimpsed corruption and decided to go to the paper. They thought I was avenging a principle. They constructed me as noble because that was a comfortable narrative. It is more interesting and more terrifying when justice arrives with a familiar face. The moment the prosecutor examined my father, calling him by name for the man who had siphoned public funds to pay for a miracle patio, he looked at me and his pupils shrank like a camera adjusting to light. "You?" he mouthed later in the holding room, as if some human had forgotten to be a brick in his facade. I watched the trial like someone watching an orchestra where the instruments had been tuned to hum betrayal. My testimony was calm and exact. I knew the numbers by heart. I spoke slowly, like a surgeon, because the law is a scalpel that cuts only where the wound is obvious. My voice did not tremble when I described wire transfers, when I read receipts that smelled like perfume and gas. The courtroom listened as if tuning in for a soap opera. My parents' friends in the gallery shifted their weight like guilty birds. My sister sat behind our mother, red-eyed and empty-handed. She had traded the BMW for a lender's mercy and a monthly bill that sat in her mailbox like a small stone. She met my eye once during the trial. For a second, she looked like someone who had been unmasked on stage, more naked than shameful. She mouthed a single word that could have been an apology. It could have been an accusation. Why? Because you do not choose where you are loved. I had long ago stopped asking for reasons and made a plan. After the conviction, after my father's jaw set like stone and the cameras asked for a comment from the daughter who walked away, I did something I had not told anyone. I went to the house. The driveway was taloned with yellow tape. The caretakers had not yet been allowed to remove the furniture. The red bow still hung on the BMW in the garage, its color gone a little dull from the sun. My mother had insisted the bow be left, since it meant something to her. Some public talisman for their dignity. I sat in their living room on the very couch where, as a teenager, I'd done homework while my parents pretended not to listen to the radio. The house smelled of lemon cleaner and fear. I poured myself a glass of water from their big, noisy refrigerator and looked at the portraits on the wall. My parents in a happier light, my sister with her first bouquet, me, younger, forced to smile at Christmas while someone else took the picture. There was a soft knock at the door. A bailiff, kindly as old tax forms, pushed a thin envelope across the welcome mat. "You have a delivery," he said. Inside the envelope was a small, white card. On it, in my father's neat handwriting, were the words, "For Alina, forgive me." I had left a quarter and a note in their mailbox years before when I was a child and thought forgiveness had a price. Sometimes people who aren't used to silence will shout into it to see what's left. He had not known how to speak to me when I was standing in front of him, without a camera. I did not pick up the card. I left the house empty, handed but not empty, hearted. Revenge is not a neat thing. It is an accumulation. It is the slow building of a structure that will one day be understood as a whole. 3 months after the conviction, at the sentencing, I sat in the back row. The courtroom smelled of old varnish and new shame. My parents had grown thin. My mother mumbled about trials, as if trials were a wardrobe she would change out of. My sister was there too, but she did not speak. She had turned into a sort of public work of art. Admired, then derided, then pitied. She was alone because the people who had applauded the showroom now avoided the street where their house used to be. As the judge read the sentences, as my father looked down at his shoes and my mother searched the ceiling for a mercy that would not come, the gallery shifted. Someone in the crowd started to clap, a single, absurd, cruel sound. It felt like applause for a performance the world had finally recognized as a play constructed on theft. When it was over, and the guards led them out with practiced tenderness, my sister fell to her knees in the hallway outside the courtroom. She pressed her fists to the marble like a child and sobbed in a way that peeled the varnish off the world. Why? She shrieked at the corridor like a person who needs the concrete to register grief. Why did you do this to us? I stepped forward then, and the cameras turned as if I were a magnet, pulling iron filings. My hair was still short. I wore an ordinary coat. I moved slowly, because drama is sometimes created in the way a person chooses to take one small, decisive step. "You asked me the first night," I said, and I let my voice be a small, flat instrument. "You asked for something. You thought it was money." She looked up at me then, and the woman who had been groomed for applause recognized me, truly recognized me, because I was not an abstraction anymore. I was the one who had brought the evidence. I was the one who had spoken to auditors and journalists. I was the one who had left the house and then come back as a stranger with a lawyer's voice and a ledger's patience. "You gave your daughter a bow," I said. "You gave me $2. Her lips formed the word, Alina, like a prayer or an accusation. She reached for me as if she could reconnect the pieces with a touch. I did not take her hand. "I blocked you at 2, I told her softly, the hour-like punctuation. I had been block and departure, exile and strategy. I had been the one to walk away, so that I could come back as an accuser, as the person who turned a page into a verdict. The cameras liked this moment. They thought it would be the end of the story. They expected tears, reconciliation, a manufactured healing. They did not expect a second twist. Months later, when the estate was being liquidated and the red bow was auctioned off like a curiosity at a yard sale, I went to the auction. People came to gawk at the artifacts of a fall. My sister did not. She stayed at home with unpaid invoices, scrolling through old footage of her own life, videos where the bow caught sunlight like a small halo. I bid quietly on a lot of small things. A silver spoon engraved with their names, a bowl my grandmother had made. I left the bow to the highest bidder. It went for more than anyone expected. The man who bought it was thin and smelled faintly of old books. As the auctioneer rattled off the price, The man winked at me, a secret shared between two people who read the world the same way. Weeks later, I received a package in an anonymous brown box. Inside, wrapped in tissue paper, was the red bow. A tag was attached with a single typed line. For the daughter who learned to count more than money. My hands shook as I touched it. It felt like the head of a small comet shaped out of ribbon. I could have left it on my bed, a trophy of victory. I could have had it sewed into a jacket like a scar. But I'll tell you the last thing because a confession has an ending, and mine is not neat. The night I left, I had kept the $2. I had folded them under my mattress in a room that smelled like dust and the last of a ruined summer. I had gone on to buy cheap coffee and bus tickets and nights in hostels. I had learned how to be invisible and how to be a blade. Years later, when everything had been unraveled, when my parents' names were redacted from plaques, and my sister's followers drifted like moths from an unlit lamp, I cashed those $2 at a pawn shop and paid for a small, plain ring, nothing showy, a band that fit like a closing fist. I signed the paperwork with my real name. I stood in front of a small plaque the city had removed from the community board where my father were used to preside. The plaque was heavy with brass and the memory of speeches. I took the $2 coin and hammered into it the letter A, not for victory, not for arrogance, but for a mark, a place to sign the ledger of my own life. Then, in the quiet after the courthouse lights, I walked across the street and placed the coin inside a crack in the stone of the community center steps. I put the red bow on top like a flag and covered it with a thin layer of dirt. I pressed it down with the heel of my hand until the dust stuck to the ribbon and the coin could no longer be seen. It was not dramatic, it was not loud. It was a burial that fit my hands. When my sister finally deleted her accounts and took the calluses from her fingertips, she asked me one last time, in a voice that sounded like a child who had lost their favorite toy, "Why didn't you just tell us how you felt?" Because if I had told them how I felt, they would have put a bow on it and put it in their stories. They would have made my suffering into a picturesque chapter they could leaf through and then close. They would have turned me into a lesson. Instead, I turned their empire into evidence. I turned their songs into silence. I took the thing they had used to define worth and used the law to dismantle it. In the end, they were judged not for loving the wrong child so much as for loving the wrong thing, the appearance of generosity, the machinery of respect. They lost their houses, their seats on the boards, the soft rumor of their names when people spoke them at gala dinners. My sister lost the BMW and the platform she'd been given. She lost the sense that a bow could solve things. And I walked away at 2 a.m., and I came back as a woman who knew how to count. I will not pretend I am not changed. Revenge is not clean. It is a slow erosion that leaves you with a shape that is recognizably you but not tender. There are evenings when I wake with the taste of lemon cleaner in my mouth and the echo of my father's laugh in my bones. There are nights when I hear my mother's voice in my head, rehearsing apologies she never learned how to deliver. The last thing I did was simple, because satisfaction is often a quiet animal. I sent my sister a photograph. It was taken from the angle of the courthouse steps. My thumb brushed the edge of the frame, showing the red bow half, buried in the dust, the coin shining a little like a promise. On the back I typed 3 words and then deleted them. I typed others. I pressed send. Her reply came quickly. It said simply, "You monster." I kept the image. I keep it under my pillow where it is warm with remembered heat. I am not proud of how much of myself vested in the ruin of those who raised me. I am clear only about the arithmetic of being seen. Some people will buy your visibility with gifts wrapped in red. I chose, instead, to buy mine with patience and a coin. I blocked them at 2 because it was the hardest thing I could offer myself, an exit that was also an entrance. If the story shocks you, then good. It should. They should have been shocked first. They had spent a lifetime practicing surprise as a weapon against those they loved the least. They had been experts at magic, making affection appear to be worth more than it was. When you hand someone a car and a bow, you have made a measurement of worth. When you give someone $2, you have made a sentence. I made mine into a verdict. The court gave them the law. I gave them the truth. The red bow is now a small thing under a small coin in a crack in the stone. Some nights I still wait for a knock at the door. Sometimes I imagine them standing there. My father asking me to bend the law back into a favor. My mother with pearls like a plea. I would open the door and show them the coin and the bow and say, "You gave this to me." I would tell them calmly that I had cashed it and bought patience and finally paid the debt. They think they taught me how to ask. In reality, they only taught me what not to accept. I left at 2 a.m. and I blocked them because I needed to be someone who could look at the world and no longer allow the illusion of a red bow to weigh more than a life. When the lights go off now, I listen for the echo of applause that used to play in my childhood house. It is quiet, and I am satisfied in the place where satisfaction becomes something more like a settlement. I am not a saint. I am not a monster. I am a woman who built a life out of the smallest currency they would give me, and I used it to buy the thing they thought they owned: dignity.